Good morning and welcome to the North Shore Unitarian Church's first Sunday service of 2021, the beginning of a new year and the unfortunate end of the holidays. My name is Ryan Gunther and I am serving as your Sunday service associate this morning. Today we're joined by John Slattery, a founding member of Beacon Unitarian Church and current member here at North Shore. He has served on the executive of both the Canadian Unitarian Council and the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, and he received the Nancy and Victoria Knight Award for his contributions to Unitarianism in Canada. Before retiring, he was a community college administrator, and after retirement, he earned a certificate in theological studies from the Vancouver School of Theology just for fun. Today, John will tell us about the life and trials of Michael Servetus, who, like so many prominent figures in Unitarianism, wasn't technically a Unitarian. He was a heretic in the best sense of the word and paid a heavy price for it. Spoiler alert, Servetus is not famous for living a long time. The world of the 16th century was different from today in many ways. Their plague was more deadly. Their version of online arguments had to be carried out by letter or published books and lasted months or even years. And of course, the church was much more powerful. Some differences, however, are largely cosmetic. People today are still persecuted for spreading dangerous ideas. The only difference is what ideas are considered to be dangerous. As Voltaire may have said, to learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. Right now, Stephen Donziger, a lawyer who won a multi-billion-dollar judgment against Chevron for contaminating the Amazon, is under house arrest on spurious charges while being prosecuted by a private law firm paid by Chevron. Edward Snowden is in exile for exposing the NSA's domestic surveillance program, and Chelsea Manning is in prison for exposing various American war crimes. Plus ça change, n'est-ce pas? And so this morning, I dedicate the lighting of our flaming chalice to all those who speak their truth and are persecuted for it. We kindle this flame as a symbol of our gathering. May the light of understanding illuminate our darkness. May the warmth of sharing bring us peace. And now I invite you to sing along with Allison in our opening hymn, number 106, Who Would True Valor See? The words are in your order of service.
Who would true valor see? Let him come hither. Morning. Well, I trust that opening hymn woke everybody up. It certainly did me. I'll start off with a bit of a personal note. Back in the fall of 2005, Joy and I attended a conference of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists in Montserrat, Spain, which is northwest of Barcelona. Over the course of the week that we were there at the conference, we had an opportunity to visit the birthplace, or rather the place where Michael Servetus actually grew up. That was in Villanova, in Aragon. So 2 busloads of us left Montserrat and headed up to Villanova. When we arrived, we were royally greeted when we got there. The mayor was there with a change of office, various other dignitaries were there. And that home that I described is now a museum dedicated to Michael Servetus. So we had a great greeting was there. But one of the things that really struck me personally, more than anything else, was the opening words of the president of the local Michael Servetus Institute. And these were the words that he greeted us with. Welcome. We have here 95 Unitarians from 23 countries and 5 continents. We have waited 450 years for this. Talk about a royal welcome. Over the course of the next several hours, we fed a meal. We had a tour of the museum, of course. We learned a little bit more about the life of Michael Servetus. And there was a worship service conducted by 3 ministers from 3 different countries celebrating or commemorating the life of Michael Servetus. This included a reading by Clifford Reed, who is the minister of the Unitarian Church in Ipswich, England. And you'll hear that reading as part of our meditation. Eventually, the day was drawing to a close. It was time to leave the museum. Dusk was coming in, but there was still one more ceremony to go. As we left the building, we were each handed a medallion, which is what I'm wearing now, and also a candle, and invited to go out in front of the museum. And there in the town square, directly in front of the museum, was a statue of Michael Servetus, slightly larger than life statue. That statue was facing the home that he grew up. And not insignificantly, his back was to the Catholic Church on the other side of the square. I don't know about you, but I've always found some interesting significance in that fact. In any case, we took our candles. A few words were said in Spanish, unfortunately, so I couldn't quite follow it. Some words were said. Some villagers, people from the town itself, started to join us with their own candles. We stood there in silence for a while with the candles on 3 sides of the statue. And then the church bells began to ring, slowly, quietly, as if it were a dirge. After a few moments, the bells began to get louder, more frequent. It began to assume a joyous quality to it. It was a celebration at this point, celebrating our presence as Unitarians in the church where our spiritual forefather had grown up. It was most impressive. Shortly after that, it was time to head back to Montserrat, and so we did. So probably it would come to no surprise to you that I was really, really motivated to prepare a worship service on Michael Servetus. Well, that's all well and good, but it's one thing for me to be motivated to prepare a service like this. It's another thing for you to be motivated to listen to it. In the dozen times that I've actually delivered this service all over BC and Newfoundland, I was asked a couple of times, well, that's all very interesting, all that historical stuff, but what's the message for us today? Why should I be listening to this service? So I've given that some thought. And my answer really is, well, why do people do genealogy work? Why do they are interested in tracing back the histories of their ancestors? To try to find out, when did they come to Canada? What brought them here? What did they do for a living? What size families did they have? And even further back, some genealogies I've heard of go back not just dozens, but sometimes hundreds of years. And then you can do a reverse genealogy and trace some of those ancestors back to the present day. Maybe there are third, fourth, fifth cousins somewhere out there that you've never met, never even knew existed, but you share a common ancestor. And what fun is it to try to look them up and say, do you remember your great-great-grandfather? Do you know anything about him? And so to track those historical facts. The situation is exactly the same here. Michael Servetus is a spiritual ancestor of us Unitarians here in Canada. And in the same way, he is the spiritual ancestor of Unitarians all over the world. And isn't it interesting to trace those connections downwards, down to these other churches, these other nations where you find Unitarians? So you can compare notes. How did your movement get started? What brought you to this point of being Unitarian? So it's exactly the same answer. He is our spiritual ancestor, one of several. And that's why this is important for you to know. And why it's important to you to know how Unitarianism is played out in other parts of the world as well, because they have the same spiritual ancestor. And now for our next hymn. It is a Latin hymn. It was written around the same time as Michael Servetus was in Villeneuve. So it may well be that he may have heard this hymn in his youth, attending church across the square. The hymn. It is the dawn of the 16th century. It's a time of great change, a time of challenge, and a time of danger. The beginning of this century sees the rise of the great European powers, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and of course, Spain. Spain's power is resting on its overseas possessions, which it is just beginning to acquire across the vast ocean in the New World. Also, the Renaissance is spreading north into Central and Northern Europe. There's a new understanding about the world that is beginning to develop and our place in it. The rise of science, Copernicus and Galileo, the rise of humanism and openness to new ideas, the questioning of the beliefs of centuries starts to occur in all fields. There is, during this period, increasing disillusion with the established church, with the richness and corruption, with the venality of its prelates, and its loss of moral authority. Result, the Reformation. And the printing press comes into its own. Miguel Civito Conesa was born in 1511 in the small northeastern Spanish town of Villanueva, almost within sight of the Pyrenees. He was a gifted child who knew Spanish, French, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew by age 13. He was a child prodigy. He was doted on by his parents. He got the best teachers. He was resented by his less talented siblings. He was looked at as being somewhat odd by his peers, and in general, he grew up to believe that he was better, smarter, and more worthy than any other of his contemporaries. Sounds a bit like a spoiled brat. At the age of 13, he was sent to the University of Zaragoza, the capital of Aragon. There he came under the tutelage of a man by the name of Juan Quintana, its most prominent faculty member, and he became his page. He studied, while at the university, privately, the classics and the humanities, and the works of one Martin Luther. He accompanied his mentor to the University of Barcelona for 2 years in the capacity as his private secretary. As part of that job, at the age of 17, he was sent by his father, who felt that, well, studying the arts is all nice and good, but we need to get you into some program where you can actually earn a living. Law. So he sent him to the University of Toulouse in France to study law. In his father's opinion, Toulouse, being a very conservative and pious city known for its orthodoxy, would be a safe place for his precocious son. But the university, with its 10,000 students and 600 faculty, was a hotbed of radicalism. He was exposed to all kinds of subversive reformist works, and most subversive of all, to the Bible itself, which Catholics in that day, until recently in fact, were not encouraged to read the Bible alone. After 2 years of studying law there, he returned to his position as secretary to his renowned mentor. And now he was himself now employed as secretary to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles. He went with him to attend Charles's coronation by the Pope in Rome. There he observed the ceremonial pomp and lavish attention that was being attended to the Pope. And he was repulsed by the whole spectacle. Now his thinking was already radicalized, and this radicalized him even more. He'd had it with the church. So he leaves his position, and he goes to Basel, Switzerland, itself a bastion of the Protestant Reformation. He's taken there into the home of a man by the name of Oecolampadius, which means house light, translated. And there he had intense discussions with him on matters theological. At first, this older man was delighted to have this young genius as his guest. But after a while, the discussion started to get somewhat tense, particularly when Servetus began to share his ideas about the Trinity. Namely, he didn't believe in it. Things really came to a head when he began to argue that there was nothing in the Bible that really supported the Trinity, and that while God may manifest himself in different ways, there is no Trinity as commonly understood. Dialogue between the two men began to degenerate. into argument, and finally to a stiff exchange of notes. Finally, Ecolampadius had had enough. He turned against him and began to denounce him to his fellow Swiss reformers. This upset Servetus. He didn't understand why he had done that. And I'll give you a quotation from a letter that he wrote to his guest. If you find me in error on one point, you should not on that account condemn me in all. The greatest of the apostles were sometimes in error. Even though you see clearly how Luther errs on some points, you do not condemn him. And I sought your instruction, but instead you rejected me. Such is the fragility of humanity that we condemn the others as impostors and impious and exempt our own, for no one recognizes his own error. I consider it a serious matter to kill men because they are in error on some question of scriptural interpretation, when we know that even the elect ones may be led astray into error. So here we find an argument in favor of freedom of thought. In any case, Michael Servetus found it now expedient to flee Basel, and he resurfaces in the more friendly confines of Strasbourg. There he writes his first significant work, entitled On the Errors of the Trinity. He published it in 1531. It was not a very temperate piece of writing. He heaped scorn on the traditional Catholic interpretation of the Trinity and on those who used it to accumulate power and riches for themselves. A bit of a digression here, the power of the printing press. The Errors of the Trinity had a press run of 1,000 copies. They sold out immediately. For literature of this kind was rather like the National Enquirer of its day, titillating, subversive, and anti-establishment. The literate public loved it. At this point, Michael Servetus gets a little carried away. He decides to send complimentary copies of his work to all the leading leaders, both Catholic and Reformist, in Europe. He was 19 years old when he wrote it. He learned a very sharp lesson at this point. Everybody suddenly was turning on him. Servetus and his book were now condemned by everybody. The Spanish Inquisition condemned Michael Servetus to death in absentia and in secret. According to canon law, when such a condemnation is made, the results have to be published by being posted on a church door. Well, the Inquisition posted it all right on a church door, just as dusk was falling, and they took it down the next morning before anybody could read it. The reason they did it in secret, because they wanted to lure Servetus back to Spain, where they could burn him at the stake. They even sent his brother to visit him, to try to talk him to coming back to visit with the family. But Servetus was having none of it. The ploy didn't work. So now, condemned by Catholics and Protestant Reformed leaders alike, Michael Servetus disappears. We will now pause for a musical interlude. The year is now 1533. A young man by the name of Michael de Villeneuve, quote unquote, enrolls as a student in the University of Paris. There he joins the radical reformist faction, since France at this point and its king are relatively tolerant when it comes to such things as theology at this point. And he makes quite a splash for himself. He is popular, prominent, and respected in those circles. Another young man also attends the university at the same time. His name is John Calvin. He struggled, not very successfully, to make a name for himself. And he later writes his own book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he considers to be the most important work in Christendom outside of the Bible. He published it in 1534, and he regards Villeneuve as a dangerous ideological enemy. So here on the one hand you have Calvin, the somber, coldly logical reformer, convinced that humanity is inherently depraved, and Villeneuve, brilliant, charismatic, persuasive, who believes that there is a divine spark in every living thing. You couldn't find two men more different, temperamentally or theologically. Around this time, Francis I turns against the reformers, and both men find it expedient to go elsewhere. Calvin heads to Basel, Switzerland. Villeneuve, quote unquote, heads to Lyon in southern France. Here you have a young man, still only 23 years old, trained in law, the arts, and humanities, fluent in at least 5 languages, with ego to match, and no money. So he takes up editing work. Now, editors back in those days didn't just correct the grammar and the spelling and make sure all the words made sense. Editors back in those days could actually revise some of the text they were editing to improve it or to correct it, as so-called. And this is what editors did. He had access to ancient copies which were being printed in astronomy, geography, and medicine. And he was editing all these works. He particularly got intrigued with the medical ones. In 1536, Francis I of France eases up on his hostility to the reformers. He did go back and forth quite a lot. And so Villeneuve returns to the University of Paris, this time to study medicine, and promptly becomes one of its top students. He assists the leading medical practitioners at the university by performing dissections on human cadavers in class. Now, I should point out that such actions were done usually by the lowest people on the medical rung, namely the surgeon barbers. So you get a haircut and you have your appendix out in the same visit. The doctors, the ones who taught at university, would never touch a cadaver. They rarely ever touched a human body, period. But Michael Servetus, as one of the top students, there were 2 students a year who was chosen by the top doctors in the Faculty of Medicine to actually perform that work of dissection. Villeneuve became entranced and began a deep study of the human body and how it actually functioned. Among which were the circulatory system. He worked out that the veins and the arteries which he could see and the smaller vessels that developed from them must be linked in some way He couldn't see it because they were too small. Microscopes weren't in use at this point. But he figured they must be there. So he was the initial discoverer of the human circulatory system. More on that later. In any case, he did manage, as is customary in his case, to annoy the medical faculty by openly criticizing their knowledge and abilities. 3 years later, however, at the age of 27, he finally graduated and set himself up as a country doctor near Lyon. He moves to Vienne on the Rhone River soon after and sets up his practice there. A very successful practice, I might add. He becomes acquainted with the leading civil and church officials, including the local Cardinal Archbishop, and even one of the chief inquisitors from Paris. Many of these people become his patients, in fact. They were certainly his admirers and supporters. He soon has position, money, and prestige. The dozen or so years he spends there are probably the happiest and most successful of his life. Also, it should be noted, he did not restrict his practice to just the rich. He treats the poor as well, including, and this is quite exceptional, victims of the plague. As if he didn't have enough else to do, he continued his editing work on the side. One of the books that he was called upon to edit was the Pagnino Bible. This was a special Bible which had, in columns, texts written in Hebrew, in Greek, and in Latin. His work on that Bible rekindled his interest in matters of doctrine and scripture. He began to enter into some discussions on these topics with some of his closest friends who could be trusted to be quiet about these discussions. One of those friends suggested to Servetus that he should enter into correspondence with another noted reformer by the name of John Calvin. Now, Calvin, by this time, had set himself up in Geneva, Switzerland. He was the chief theological authority in town, and he virtually ran the place for a while. And he ran it in a way that the Taliban would have been quite proud of. He had his own informers, his own secret police. People could be whipped for discussing business on the church steps after a service, just to give you one idea. And of course, Lord help you if you missed a Sunday service. We'll come back to that too. In any case, he did enter into correspondence with Villeneuve. So here you had Calvin, coldly logical, dispassionate, and officious, and you have Villeneuve, passionate, sarcastic, and condescending. They made quite a pair. Villeneuve, at some point, sends to Calvin a revised copy of his Errors of the Trinity. That was not a good idea. Calvin begins to suspect who this Villeneuve person really is at this point. And he got tired of this correspondence, so he decides he's going to sort out Calvin, he's going to sort out Villeneuve once and for all. So he sends him a copy of his own work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. That should set him straight. Well, Villeneuve, when he received this book, he studied it. He scribbled his own observations in its margins, like a professor grading a term paper of a not particularly accomplished student. And then he sent it back to Calvin. Calvin's reaction can only be imagined. He was furious, and he was determined to bring down this Villeneuve, namely, we now believe was Servetus, once and for all. He wants him executed for heresy. But how to do it? At first, he has very little success. Nobody believes him, particularly the Catholic authorities. After all, he's John Calvin, the reformer. Who's going to believe him? Michael Servetus, in the meantime, writes his own book called The Restoration of Christianity, which is his definitive answer to John Calvin. In it, he talks about the impropriety of infant baptism, the contortions of the scriptures, the myth that was the Trinity. He asserts that God exists in all things, in contrast with Calvin, who believes that humanity is inherently depraved. And he includes in this work a rather curious section describing the human circulatory system 60 years before William Harvey rediscovered it and received all the credit. That's changing now, actually. Now, why would something like that be in a book of theology? Well, remember that this is the Renaissance period. This is the time when there was a strong belief that all knowledge is closely interrelated, that you cannot study medicine without understanding theology. You cannot understand anything about the skies without understanding mathematics. All the fields of human knowledge are interrelated. So it's not surprising that he found that he describing the human circulatory system as an act of God was in his book. Hang on to that thought. In this book, his language has become sophisticated, and his arguments are laid out in great detail. At the front of the book, he included all 30 of the letters that he had sent to John Calvin. He had 800 copies secretly published, privately printed. One set went to Frankfurt, one set went to Geneva, and the third set he kept in Lyon for safekeeping. Calvin, when he became aware of the books in Geneva, ordered them seized and destroyed. He redoubles his efforts against Servetus. He cuts the section containing the letters to himself out of his own copy of that book and sends them to, through third parties, to France, to the authorities there, hoping that this will precipitate his arrest and hopefully trial and execution. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because Villeneuve has too good a reputation. Nobody believes that this fellow could possibly be the notorious Michael Servetus. Calvin makes a last desperate attempt. He sends the actual letters he had received from Villeneuve to the Inquisitor General of France in Paris. This matter comes to the attention of the Inquisitor General of France, an austere, dour heresy hunter. Once he takes a look at this and can compare the handwriting to other documents of Michael Servetus, which he has in his possession, he concludes there's enough correspondence between the two to warrant Servetus' arrest. And so he orders it. Servetus is arrested. But because he's so highly regarded as Villeneuve, he is kept in what can only be described as a very comfortable type of house arrest. He has access to all of his worldly goods, including his money. He keeps all of his possessions. He's allowed to go out into the garden for exercise if he wishes to do so. It's a very comfortable existence. But Servetus knows that this is only temporary. This is not going to last. He decides it's time to disappear a second time. So one fine day, he hops over the wall and heads off. His intention is to get to Italy, where in the vicinity of Naples, he knows there's a small Reformed community down there, and he hopes to be able to serve as their doctor. Now, there are three ways to get to Naples. One is by sea. He had the money. He could pay passage, not a problem. Or he could go overland along the coast, a little longer, but it would be comfortable. Or he could go through the mountains of the Alps. That latter course would take him through Geneva. For some reason, nobody seems to quite understand, he chose to take the last route through Geneva. He arrives on a Saturday evening. The next day is Sunday, and he's well aware that the expectation is that you must go to church or you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So Servetus takes himself to a local church. But why he chose to go to John Calvin's own church, nobody knows. He does that, he is recognized, and he is arrested. This time, his cell is not very comfortable. Quite the contrary. All his possessions are seized, including all of his money. He can't buy any new clothes. They are, after a while, become rags. He himself becomes ill. He's not very well at all. And in this condition, he is finally brought to trial. There are 39 charges raised against him. But once Servetus gets into the courtroom, remember, he's been trained in law, he makes mishmash out of the prosecutor's case. So well does he destroy that case that Calvin becomes alarmed. And finally, he realizes that he's got to go into the court himself to confront Servetus, which he does. The two of them then engage in a tremendous debate. It's like two master chess players going at each other. Their arguments are abstract, obtuse, and very quickly delivered. Nobody in the courtroom is able to follow the discussion. But the outcome is preordained. There is no way that Michael Servetus is going to get away this time. He is found guilty of 2 charges: preaching that children should not be baptized at birth and denying the Trinity. On the basis of those charges, he is condemned to be burned at the stake. On October 27th, 1553, he's led in solemn procession to Champel, just outside of Geneva, to be burned alive at the stake. It was designed to be a slow, lingering death. And so it was. It took him half an hour to die. But he never renounced his beliefs. The next song is Tinto 58, written in 1644. Although this is almost a century after Servetus' death, it seems appropriate at this point.
Reflection. From a martyred soul remembered. Breath of God, which we have breathed since the moment of our birth, and will breathe until the moment of our death, We rest in quietness to feel your entry and your exit. You bring us life, entering our lungs, entering our blood, carried around our bodies, through our hearts, as they toil without ceasing. We rest in quietness to feel the circulation of the blood. Spirit of God, coursing through our veins, almost since the moment of our conception, enlivening our bodies and our souls and making us divine. Open our minds to your presence and our hearts to your love.
Some concluding comments. Despite the efforts to destroy all of Michael Servetus' books, there are 3 known surviving copies of the original books. One, a singed copy, when examined, was found to contain all sorts of scribbled comments and was obviously used by the prosecutor in the trial of Michael Servetus. That book is now in the National Library in Paris. Another copy, which now resides in the library of the University of Edinburgh, has the first 16 pages missing. That is Calvin's own copy. Remember, he took those first 16 pages out, containing Villeneuve's letters. Then there is the third copy. That one has an interesting history in itself. That third copy didn't surface for another 100 or so years. Sometime around 1650, a Unitarian Hungarian count visits London, and he starts to peruse through the local bookstores. And in one of them, he finds a copy of the Restoration. He buys it. When he returns home, he donates it to the Unitarian Church in Kolozsvár. About a century after that, the minister of the Kolozsvár Church gives the book to another Hungarian noble to gain support for the Unitarian cause, which is under some threat at this point. That noble, in turn, presents the book to the Austrian Emperor Joseph II. That book now resides in the Imperial Library in Vienna. Passages from this book obviously came to other people's attentions. Voltaire in the 17th century quotes it. So does Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century. But from our standpoint, in terms of his legacies, I think we need to look to the founders of the Unitarian movement in both Hungary and Poland. Well, the founders of those movements, those who really got Unitarianism off the ground, Socinus in Poland, Socinus, and also Francis David in Hungary. From their writings, it's obvious that they were well aware of at least some of Servetus' own words, because you find them in those writings. And it's from the Polish Unitarians that our Unitarianism has come down through the centuries. After the Catholic Church pretty much demolished the Unitarian Church in Poland, many of the books that were produced in Krakow, Poland, the big printing press there, so spread throughout Europe as these people carried them elsewhere to other countries. First to Amsterdam, and then eventually to England. And from England to the New World. And from the New World to us. So we are the spiritual descendants of Michael Servetus. We are his spiritual descendants. We are part of that genealogy, spiritual genealogy. It's been a good journey. I enjoyed making it when preparing this presentation, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Make a point of checking out some of these churches in other countries. See what their genealogy looks like. Thank you. Yep. Hymn 107.
Now sing we of the brave of foe, who would not sell themselves for gold, yet left us riches manifold. Alleluia! Of those who fought a goodly fight, for liberty, for truth and right, their patient love, their chiefest might. Alleluia! Who when no gleam did point the way, pressed ever on by night, by day, and spite of pain did ever say, Alleluia! Who long the world's old sorrows bore, and toiled and loved and suffered sore, and being dead live evermore. Alleluia!
We are the North Shore Unitarian Church, and our mission is to empower people to live with greater depth, meaning, and purpose. If this is your first time with us, participating from home, we would love for you to say hi in the comment section. You will find a warm welcome, I'm sure. In this community, we celebrate people from all walks of life. No matter how you experience the sacred, no matter who you are or who you love, we hope you will feel welcome. We are a busy congregation with a lot going on, so please read your weekly e-bulletin. If you haven't already subscribed to the e-bulletin, you can do that by clicking on the link in the YouTube description or by emailing our church administrator. The address is on our website. But there's one thing I want to particularly draw your attention to this morning. Our new environmental action team would like your feedback. They have their first meeting on January 27th at 7:15 on Zoom, and it is open to everyone. And they are also conducting a survey, so if you haven't already, please fill that out. The link is in the e-weekly, and the deadline is January 15th. Thank you for your participation in these activities and for your attention. We hope that you found today's service meaningful and will join us again. If you haven't yet done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment. And now, please join with me as we extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but carry with us the light of vision and the warmth of hope. The world calls us to live with depth, meaning, and purpose. We go forth with courage and love. And now I invite you to sing along with possibly yourself in a video of our congregation singing our closing song, Circle Round for Freedom.
Circle